गुड इवनिंग एंड वेलकम टू गना शॉट। गना शॉट में आप सबका स्वागत है। वणक्कम, नमस्कार, सत श्री अकाल एंड जय हिंद। आज हम देखेंगे और विल नो अबाउट द एवोल्यूशन ऑफ इंडियाज अफ्रीका पॉलिसी एंड recent developments. And we'll have a dialogue with Shri Gurjit Singh, former ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, ASEAN, Ethiopia, and the African Union. It's indeed a matter of pride and honor to welcome Shri Gurjit Singh. Sir, good evening. Thanks a
Good
lot for
evening.
coming. We are honored because you're the first ambassador on Gunner Shot, and it's a great privilege for us. And
Thank you. It's my honor.
वेलकम सर। एंड मैं सबको बताना चाहता हूँ, आई शुड नॉट बी इंट्रोड्यूसिंग एन एम्बेसडर ऑफ इंडिया टू माई ऑडियंस बिकॉज his stature itself is his own introduction. But I'll introduce him on another count. Right? His father is a gunner. And it warmed my heart so much when he told me that his father is an ex-artillery officer and all that. And I said, look, that means he's got priority rights on Gunner Shot. Gunner Shot में ये उनका चैनल है, राइट? ओके, तो इसके साथ हम अफ्रीका का विल टेक अ सोजॉर्न इनटू अफ्रीका और अफ्रीका का सैर करेंगे। इससे पहले कि मैं गुड एम्बेसडर को हैंड ओवर करूं, मैं आपको एक छोटा सा इंट्रोडक्शन देता हूं अफ्रीका के बारे में, और उसके बाद विल ask the ambassador to educate us more. First thing, Africa, the great continent of rivers and desert, the great rivers like Nile, Congo, Zambezi, Niger, Limpopo, the great deserts, Kalahari and Sahara. कौन नहीं जानता सहारा डेजर्ट के बारे में? और ये एकमात्र कॉन्टिनेंट है जिसमें दोनों ट्रॉपिक चलते हैं, ट्रॉपिक ऑफ कैप्रिकॉर्न और ट्रॉपिक ऑफ कैंसर, राइट? और ये देश है जहां वाइल्ड लाइफ एंड सेंचुरीज हैं, जो बहुत लोग सफारीज के लिए जाते हैं, एंड इट इज अ बिजनेस आउट देयर, ह्यूज बिजनेस, एंड इट इज आल्सो अ लैंड फुल ऑफ मिनरल्स एंड ओर्स, राइट? लोग ये एक खजाना है जो अभी तक पूरा ढूंढा नहीं गया, पर काफी हद तक एक्सप्लॉइट भी हो चुका है। और ये वो देश, ये कॉन्टिनेंट है वेयर देयर इज एक्यूट फूड इनसिक्योरिटी। हम अकाल के बारे में सुनते हैं, फैमिन्स के बारे में सुनते हैं, भुखमरी, माइल न्यूट्रिशन, वो सब कुछ होता है। और यही वो कॉन्टिनेंट है जिसमें कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स होते हैं। और ये जो मैप आपके सामने दर्शाया गया है उसमें है जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट जोन्स हैं, कैटास्ट्रोफीज कहाँ होते हैं और वगैरह वगैरह। जहाँ जहाँ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स होते हैं वो देश, जैसे लीबिया हुआ, माली हुआ, इथियोपिया हुआ, एरिट्रिया हुआ, ये सब बड़े बड़े बोल्ड अक्षरों में यहाँ दर्शाया गया है। और यही वो कॉन्टिनेंट है जहाँ बाहुबली है, स्ट्रॉन्ग मैन ऑफ अफ्रीका, जैसे रॉबर्ट मुगाबे हुआ, मोहम्मद अल गद्दाफी हुआ, इदी अमीन हुआ, या रॉबर्ट मुगाबे हुआ, या और बहुत अनेक आए और चले गए और अभी भी हैं। और पर अमूमन हम ये नहीं जानते कि अफ्रीका ऐसे कॉन्टिनेंट है जहां 54 देश हैं, सॉवरेन देश हैं, और अलग अलग किस्म के देश हैं। कुछ डेमोक्रेसीज हैं, कुछ ऑटोक्रेसीज हैं, कुछ डिक्टेटरशिप्स हैं, कुछ गरीब देश हैं और कुछ अमीर देश हैं, और कुछ वो देश हैं जिसके पास बहुत रिसोर्सेस हैं पर वो मिसमैनेज्ड हैं। पर ये कॉन्टिनेंट के साथ हमारा भारत का बहुत बड़ा नाता है हिस्टोरिकली, राइट? हमारा 3 मिलियन इंडियंस ऑफ पीपल ऑफ इंडियन ओरिजिन रिसाइड इन इंडिया। अगर आपको याद है, हमारा खुद का स्वदेशी मूवमेंट एक्चुअली अफ्रीका में शुरू हुआ जब गांधी जी वहां थे, राइट? $70 बिलियन का आजकल भी ट्रेड होता है वहां। हमारे यूएन पीस कीपिंग फोर्स में अभी भी 4,500 लोग तैनात हैं, और बहुत कुछ, राइट? There is a historic relationship between India and Africa. And I might like to tell you that people in Africa trust Indians. That's the only thing I'll say. ये जो बाकी इसके बारे में I'll leave it to the good ambassador to talk about it. और यही वो देश है जो आजकल जिसमें चाइना का फुटप्रिंट बढ़ गया है बीआरआई के जरिए। और ये जो छोटे छोटे इमारत और बड़े बड़े इमारत ये बहुत देशों में देख रहे हो, वो है चाइनीज इन्वेस्टमेंट्स इन these countries. It amounts to nearly $160 billion और लोन्स तकरीबन 1200 लोन्स हैं तरह तरीके के। और इसमें वो देश हैं जो खुश हैं बीआरए के साथ, और वो भी देश हैं जो डेट रिडन कर्ज में डूबे हुए हैं और उनका रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग हो रहा है और ये डिफॉल्ट भी हो गए। ये 54 देश के अलग अलग रंग हैं, पर ये 54 देश जो हैं, दिस इज द यंगेस्ट कॉन्टिनेंट और ये माना जाता है दिस द फ्यूचर ऑफ द वर्ल्ड। और इस वर्ल्ड के साथ हमारा बहुत गहरा नाता है और ये नाता बहुत दिनों से है। और ये इस एवोल्यूशन के बारे में आई रिक्वेस्ट द एम्बेसडर टू प्लीज एजुकेट अस। सर, ओवर टू यू, ऑल योर्स। और आप हिंदी में बात कर सकते हो या अंग्रेजी में बात कर सकते हो, योर चॉइस, क्योंकि हमारे जो श्रोता हैं वो हिंदी में भी हैं और अंग्रेजी में भी हैं। ज्यादातर हिंदी में है, अगर हिंदी में कंफर्टेबल है तो ठीक है, नहीं भी तो चलेगा, मैं उनको ट्रांसलेट कर दूंगा।
थैंक यू जनरल शंकर। एज दे से इन ईस्टर्न अफ्रीका, हबारी
हबारी।
So if you see behind me, there's a picture of my book, The Harambe Factor, and this book is about the India-Africa Economic and Development Partnership. Harambe in Swahili means the spirit of cooperation. And that is the nature of India-Africa relationship, which is unique and different from any other relationship that Africa has with any other partner. I wrote that book because not many people knew what India was doing in Africa. And if you did a search, you normally came up with what China was doing in Africa, and India would be an add-on. No money is spent in researching what India does in Africa, but lots of think tanks in the West keep following China. Why? Because you mentioned trust. It is a sense of values. The Western countries believe that China is not on the same page as them. But more and more, they appreciate India's model of cooperation. So, if I go back from this point, and nowadays, if you watch a movie, everything goes in flashback. So, let me do a flashback first. So, India and the eastern and southern coast of Africa had a long-term trading relationship, which was centuries old. It is this route that Vasco da Gama used in 1498 when he so-called discovered India. But this route was commonly used between India, the western coast, and the Swahili coast of Africa. Secondly, if you talked about Mahatma Gandhi, so when Mahatma Gandhi went to Africa, it was in colonial times. And he also traveled to Lamu in Kenya and then to Zanzibar. And he stayed in Zanzibar for 2 weeks to understand how Indian law and administration was actually adapted in Eastern Africa. And then Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi went to South Africa. Now, there you remember that wearing his lawyer's jacket and bow tie, he got thrown out of a railway compartment first class at Pietermaritzburg. And that dented his, pride, that he said, I am going to find a new way to deal with these colonialists. So this theme of finding new ways to deal with injustice, to deal with those who dominate us, has been the leitmotif of India-Africa partnership. When India became independent, there were hardly any African countries who were independent. In 1937, when modern Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, was attacked by the Italians, India actually observed an Abyssinia Day in 1937 to bring, the atrocities being conducted by the gassing of people in Abyssinia to the fore. In 1945, when India was a charter member of the San Francisco Conference to set up the United Nations, do you know at that time there were only four independent African countries? There was the Empire of Ethiopia, there was the Kingdom of Egypt, the Kingdom of Libya, and apartheid South Africa. That's it. And it is these four countries who also participated in the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank to set it up. So I take you then to 1955, the Bandung Conference. That is the first time Afro-Asian conference is held. And that is the time that India says African aspirations must be articulated. And India invites countries from Africa which are about to become independent. This is Sudan and Ghana, then called the Gold Coast. So this made 5 African countries, 6 actually, because meanwhile Liberia had also become a part. So 6 African countries, other than apartheid South Africa, participated in the Bandung Conference. And the story goes that Sudan had no flag yet. So Pandit Nehru took out his handkerchief and drew a map of Sudan, stuck it on a pencil and put it in front of the Sudanese delegation and saying, here, you have your identity. So this idea that India would speak out for African countries to get them their just place in the international order started then and continues till today. After this, in 1963, the Organization of African Unity was created. And by that time, there were about 23 independent African countries in 1963. But in 1961, India had already helped Yugoslavia to hold the first non-aligned conference, to which it invited all the newly independent African countries. So by 1964, when UNCTAD, G77, and all these are created, African countries have an identity as they emerge from colonialism. The identity is a member of the non-aligned movement, a member of the OAU, and a membership of the UN. So they have a triple identity, in all of which India has played an important role. There were many African countries who set up their own national congress to imitate the Indian National Congress to fight for their independence. South Africa's African National Congress is one example. Now, I quickly skip, but very early, India decided that not only will it speak out for Africa, but it will share its experience of development with Africa. Whatever we can do, we will do. So one of the first things we did, besides a few scholarships and things like that, was establish the Imperial Military Academy in Harar in eastern Ethiopia. The first commandant was then Colonel, later Lieutenant General N.C. Rowley. And there are many, I think General Matthew, who's I think 90 plus now, he was an instructor there. So that was a very robust cooperation that India had in training the Ethiopian officers. But this academy in 1958 was open to other African countries who were not yet independent. So it became what later we would call a regional training institution. This academy lasted till 1977. In 1964, India established the India Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, ITEC program. In a survey that I carried out for my book, I found this is India's best brand in Africa. More people know about this than any other Indian program. Under this program, people from developing countries are invited to India to undertake programs for a week to a year. And this is fully funded by India. During the pandemic, we started doing the e-ITEC. Now, in 1964, we launched this program, whereas the United Nations only started talking of South-South cooperation in 1978. So you can see how far advanced we were. Now, from 1964 till the end of the Cold War, India continues to engage with Africa on processes of training, processes of setting military training team, military academies. From time to time, there are requests for civilian training institutions which are then provided. But it is largely political support. Wherever African countries want support in the UN system, non-aligned movement, India is there. So you may remember that in 1987, India set up an Africa Fund. The Africa meant action for resisting invasion, colonialism, and apartheid. And it helped Tanzania and several other countries who were fighting apartheid in South Africa. And India put in a lot of money into that. India also opened the offices of the ANC and Namibian SWAPO in India and provided them Indian passports to travel. So India's engagement with Africa's liberation, its identity in the world was great. And we kept trying to share our experience wherever we could. When the Cold War ended, then several things happened. One, the Western countries, which had tried to woo African countries on their side in the Cold War, now started talking of human rights, democracy, and responding to values. So some African presidents told me before the Cold War ended, I was their best buddy. Now that the Cold War has ended, they are asking me to do things which will ruin my country. So this happened a lot, and many Western countries became disenchanted with their traditional Western partners because of too many conditions being set on the aid being offered to them. Meanwhile, in many African countries, private Indian investments was moving. Now, here I want to talk about the Indian model, which I will come to later, but it starts in this century. Indian model of cooperation with Africa is private sector led. So there was a large number of Indian traders and investors even before India became independent and carried on till 2000. It kept happening. Second, there was a philanthropy attached to it. The Indian diaspora in many African countries set up educational institutions, hospitals, clinics, schools, training institutions out of their goodwill to integrate better with local societies. This aspect of capacity building and human resource development became a part of future Indian model of cooperation. And the third aspect was that there was a huge cultural interface. So people were coming and going. So the people to people dimension was very large. It is not only Indians who went to Africa to trade, but there were many Africans who came to India. The Abyssinian Empire has many buildings which had Indian architects, and you can see the swastikas in the corner in many places where Indian architects worked. So whether it is the churches of Lalibela, the palaces of Gondar, all these had a large amount of exchange. And from Africa, generals came to India and became very powerful in the Middle Ages in India. So there was a large people to people component besides trade, culture, military, and none of this was government led. Now, as an aside, I must tell you that in Hindi, when we want to say African, we say Habshi.
Yes.
And Habshi is used for all Africans. But actually, Habshi meant that you come from the land of Habsh. Habsh was Abyssinia. So the initial contacts were between Abyssinia and India, and that was the empire of Habsh. So all Africans were Habshis. This, I hope, explains the etymology.
Oh, yes, I think so.
So, and that empire of Ethiopia extended to modern Yemen across the Red Sea. So that is why when you say where was coffee discovered, people say Ethiopia and Yemen says Yemen, but actually it was one.
One.
So now what happens with the Cold War? As I told you, we have this policy going on, but it has no great rhetoric or emphasis. It is a request-based policy to Africa. African countries approach us, we support. What happens in 1996, 1998 are two negative developments which shock us. In 1996, there is an election to the UN Security Council, and for the Asian seat, India and Japan are contesting. India never expects that Africa will support Japan, which Japan supported apartheid, and we are their friends. But most African countries voted for Japan. This was a shock to us. Second, now you remember South Africa became independent, Nelson Mandela became free, and on the 18th of July was Nelson Mandela's 105th birth anniversary. So he was a great icon, Bharat Ratna, we invited him. The first cricket matches South Africa played after apartheid was with us. I mean, anything.
Yeah. Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium में हुआ था.
Correct. Yes, you remember that.
Yes.
So 1998 in Durban में एक नॉन अलाइंड समिट होती है. उसी साल भारत ने परमाणु परीक्षण भी किए थे. और लेकिन उस नॉन अलाइंड समिट में मंडेला ने दो चीजें कही. एक, कि भारत को परमाणु प्रशिक्षण नहीं करना चाहिए था, ये एनपीटी का उल्लंघन है. और दूसरा, कि अगर आपको जम्मू एंड कश्मीर में मदद चाहिए तो मैं हस्तक्षेप करने को तैयार हूं. आई एम रेडी टू मीडिएट. नाउ एज यू नो, इंडियन डिप्लोमेसी, these two are big no-nos. And coming from a friend like South Africa, which we had spent a lifetime supporting, shocked us. So there was a rethinking in Delhi. Okay? We need to rethink our African policy. That old thing about Mahatma Gandhi, decolonization, anti-apartheid, उसका जमाना चला गया. अब ये देश नए हैं, इनकी समस्याएं नहीं हैं, तो इनके साथ कैसे रिश्ते बनाए जाए. और आपको याद होगा कि 1991 में भारत की इकोनॉमिक लिबरलाइजेशन भी हुई, तो तकरीबन 2001 तक 10 साल हो गए थे और भारत की जो इकोनॉमी थी अब अच्छा प्रदर्शन कर रही थी. तो 2002 से, अब ये एक कोइंसिडेंस है कि उस समय मैं जॉइंट सेक्रेटरी अफ्रीका था, लेकिन उस समय से कई हमने नई चीजें शुरू की कि अफ्रीका को नए तरीके से देखा जाए. एक था फोकस अफ्रीका प्रोग्राम जो मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कॉमर्स ने शुरू किया, जिसके हमने शुरू में तो 10 कंट्री देखी थी, लेकिन सारा अफ्रीका कहता था हमें क्यों अवहेलना कर रहे हो, हमें भी देखो। तो फिर हमने वो फोकस अफ्रीका प्रोग्राम ट्रेड प्रमोशन के लिए पूरे अफ्रीका में लागू कर दिया। इसके अलावा हमने जो आईटेक प्रोग्राम है उसके संबंध ज्यादा बढ़कर दिए, उसकी जो ट्रेनिंग पोजीशन थी बढ़ा दी। तीसरी चीज हमने की कि 2003 के बजट में हमारे फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर ने एक अनाउंसमेंट की कि अब भारत केवल अपना तजुर्बा ही नहीं बट अपनी जो फाइनेंशियल पावर है वो भी अफ्रीका के साथ शेयर करेगा। तो इसमें एक आइडिया स्कीम का जन्म हुआ, इंडिया डेवलपमेंट असिस्टेंस स्कीम। उसके अंडर हम लो कॉस्ट लोन्स अफ्रीका को देना शुरू कर दिया। 2003 से लेकर 15 साल वो स्कीम बहुत अच्छी चली और उसके अंडर 44 अफ्रीकन कंट्रीज में $12.26 बिलियन सॉफ्ट लोन दिए गए और बहुत सारी प्राइवेट इंडियन कंपनीज को सहारा मिला कि वो इन देशों में जाएं। तो कई ऐसे देश थे जिसमें फ्रांस या पोर्चुगीज लैंग्वेज बोली जाती थी, उसमें कोई भारत का ज्यादा ट्रेड या इन्वेस्टमेंट नहीं था, वहां पर भी अब भारतीय कंपनी पहुंच गई। तो ये लाइन ऑफ क्रेडिट से बहुत बड़ा एक तो अफ्रीकन देशों को सहारा मिला कि बहुत कम राशि पे इंटरेस्ट रेट पे इनको लोन्स मिले, और दूसरा भारतीय कंपनी को सपोर्ट मिला कि वो वहां जाए। तो ये 44 कंट्रीज में हमारा एक इकोनॉमिक झंडा गाड़ा गया। 2004 में सब इसी समय हो रहा है। हमारे उस समय के राष्ट्रपति एपीजे अब्दुल कलाम अफ्रीका गए और जब वो पैन अफ्रीकन पार्लियामेंट में गए तो उन्होंने वहां कहा कि भारत में आईटी, एजुकेशन और मेडिकल ये तीन बड़ी अच्छी चीजें हैं और मैं चाहता हूं ये तीनों से हम अफ्रीका का संपर्क बढ़ाएं। तो वो जन्म हुआ पैन अफ्रीकन ई नेटवर्क प्रोजेक्ट। अब मैं थोड़ा वापस जाना चाहता हूं, 2002 में ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ऑफ अफ्रीकन यूनिटी का तबादला हुआ और वो अफ्रीकन यूनियन बन गई, एयू 2002 में।
AU,
और जब 2004 में कलाम साहब ने ये एक सुझाव रखा तो 2005 में सबसे बड़ा प्रोजेक्ट एयू के साथ ये पैन अफ्रीकन ई नेटवर्क प्रोजेक्ट भारत ने किया। अब मेरा गुड फॉर्च्यून था कि 2005 में मेरी नियुक्ति इथियोपिया में राजदूत की हुई और उस समय अफ्रीकन यूनियन ने कहा हम अपने पार्टनर देशों के राजदूत भी एक्सेप्ट कर लेंगे, तो मैं भी इथियोपिया के अलावा अफ्रीकन यूनियन को भी राजदूत बन गया। और ये जो प्रोजेक्ट था इसका इम्प्लीमेंटेशन का कमिटी का को चेयरमैन मैं था। इसके जरिए हमने 47 अफ्रीकन कंट्रीज, इन 47 अफ्रीकन कंट्रीज we opened telemedicine and tele-education centers connecting them to 12 Indian hospitals and 6 Indian universities. Now this was an amazing project. The African Union leaders could believe only when they actually saw what was happening. As a result, in 2006, the African Union decides that enough of Europe and America and Russia, we need new partners and the world has changed. So we must look for new partners. So at the AU summit in 2006, they passed a resolution for new partnerships. And the first 3 countries they approached were India, Latin America, and Brazil. But I must tell you that Europe, Japan, and China already had partnerships with Africa before the African Union was born. So it is not as if we were the first. There were already these 3 running in different ways. But among these three, India was the first among the new partners. And India accepted the partnership. And in 2008, while I was still ambassador to Ethiopia and the African Union, the first India Africa Forum Summit was held in New Delhi. The second India Africa Forum Summit was held in 2011 in Addis Ababa. At that time, now I was back home, additional secretary for Africa. So I had the good fortune of implementing two summits. The third summit was held in 2015 in Prime Minister Modi's time. I had nothing to do with that one. I was in Indonesia at that time. The fourth summit is awaited and it should be held now. Originally, the summit was to be held every 3 years. From 2015, it is now to be held every 5 years, but it was delayed by the pandemic. And then African Union's many summits of the pandemic period were delayed. So our turn will come hopefully this year and we will hold the next summit. Now, with the India-Africa summits, a new model of cooperation with Africa became noticed. And this was largely based on the three things I told you earlier happening without the government and some of the things we did between 2002 and 2005, which were part of the new Africa policy. So by this time, China was also becoming more vocal. So I must tell you, India's partnership with Africa is much older, much deeper, and much better accepted than the Chinese partnership. The Chinese partnership is newer, but it is far larger in terms of its economic ambit. Those are the two significant. Now, just to give you a comparison that India's trade with Africa when we launched the Focus Africa program 2002 was less than $3 billion. In 2022, it is $98 billion. There was hardly any Indian investment in Africa at that time. Even if it was not counted. Today, Indian investment in Africa is $75 billion. And we have $12.26 billion in soft loans. Now, it is very easy to compare this with China. Trade 200 billion, investment, you said 150 billion, this, that. But I don't think the African compares this. This is largely an academic exercise. For the African, India does better than China because we transfer more technology, educate more people, build more local capacities, and invest more in the MSME sector, which contributes to regional trade. We are not only looking, our investors are not looking only at exports. They are actually building capacity in Africa. So this is different from the colonial model, is different from the Chinese model. In trade, China is number one, but with $98 billion, India is always second or third. Some years France is ahead, some years India is ahead. We are in the top three. Where investment is concerned, with $75 billion, India is fifth. So it doesn't matter how much China does. Point is, we are an important player. That is the point I'm trying to emphasize. Now, most of the Indian investment was in small and medium enterprises. And it was never Government of India policy to push investment into Africa. But whenever our leaders, especially at the India-Africa Summit, would meet African leaders, they all spoke about the wonders of Indian investment. And we were scratching our head, what is this? Because we had no measuring scale. So one of the things my book does is measures the investment and says the impact that investment has. And today I'm happy to say that I think we are moving to an investment-led model. We are recognizing investment more. But there are three big investments in Africa. One is the Tatas, who have all over Africa doing a variety of things. Second is Airtel, which acquired assets of telecom in 14 countries. The third is Godrej. They acquired hair care assets in about 10 countries. Now, these three in Africa are seen as Indian investments. But if you see where their money comes from, it comes from international hubs like Singapore, Netherlands, Mauritius. So in our figures, it doesn't show up.
It is
But
there otherwise.
African figures, India is a major investor. So I think that is very important to note. Secondly, the expansion of the Indian diaspora in Africa has happened because of Indian investment and large number of international companies who are employing Indians because we cost less and do more. When Vedanta invested in mines in Zambia, I asked them in front of a group of journalists, how many people do you employ? They said 150,000. And how many are Indians? 15. So you see how much local employment was created. I went to a lot of floriculture farms in Ethiopia. They employ, let's say, 3,000 people. How many Indians? 5. So this was the model that people liked. Now, this is very different from the Chinese model, who everything from top to bottom is Chinese. There is no local capacity building, no local people, even the machine instructions are in Chinese. Now, what India did was, it after in the India-Africa summit, highly expanded the education and capacity building model. So not only did we increase scholarships, increase high-tech programs, we created special Africa-focused training programs in India, but we also offered to establish 100 training institutions in Africa. That was a game changer. Africa realized, this guy wants to actually come and help us. Now, why are these training institutions important in Africa? We are in India a very young country. Our median age is 27. In Africa, the median age is 19. They are that young. Now, in Africa, the market is scattered. I mean, every country has a middle class. But all of Africa has a middle class of about 500 million people. But they are not one market. But today with the Africa Continental FTA, you can consider regional markets. So that is why there are greater opportunities to invest. But I'll come to that. So India pushed more lines of credit. At the first summit, we announced 5.4. Second summit, we announced another 5. And in the third summit, we announced 10. So totally, there were about $15 billion on offer, out of which, as I mentioned to you, 12.26 actually implemented. Now, we started investing in training institutions in Africa. This succeeded where countries were interested. If they took ownership, the project would succeed. If they were indifferent, the project would not succeed. But approach that the human resource rather than the natural resource of Africa is important to us is the message that we convey. And that was very important because natural resource was depleting. Chinese were taking it out. Human resource was increasing. The Indians were training it. This was the juxtaposition. Now, if you look, I'm going to come to the last part.
No problems. You take your time.
Oh, I think I've explained the Indian model.
Yeah. You have very well explained the whole thing.
Now I want to know, where are we now? So, as I said, in between, we started asking African countries to provide support to India for permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Almost all African countries bilaterally in some document or the other have already said so. Second, we wanted condemnation of cross-border terrorism. This also they've all said so. So, in 2023, what is your new mantra that you want with Africa? This recalls because you see, what did, okay, so before COVID came, 2019, Africa became a big opportunity because for the first time, the investment in Africa was more than the aid to Africa. Now, this is very significant. Africa was transitioning from an aid basket to an investment destination. And the Agenda 2063 of the African Union had Africa Continental FTA as a model, which was implemented in 2021 because delayed by the pandemic. But what this was doing now was encourage investors to come. Unfortunately, the pandemic came. So with the pandemic, again, Africa became dependent on aid, particularly to deal with public health and COVID. Secondly, the Africa Continental FTA said everybody open your borders. The pandemic said everybody close your borders.
Close your borders. Okay.
So Africa was caught in these contradictions. Whatever budgets they had to support industry were now being diverted to public health. So this created huge problems for Africa. And Africa, like India, was promised the benefit of globalization, which meant if you adopt free trade, you will get more trading opportunities. And if you come to climate change, we will give you more money for mitigation, but not for
That never
adaptation.
happens.
Now, with the pandemic, both these things collapsed. There were no new funds coming. The protectionism was killing your trade, which you had invested in. So Africa, like many of us, was in deep trouble. 2 years later, Africa is recovering. But during this period, they know that one country which came to their resistance with vaccines was India. Almost all of Africa got Indian vaccines, either directly as a gift or as a commercial sale or through the COVAX facility. Now, COVAX facility is funded by all the big OECD countries who make vaccines but never gave any vaccine, only gave the money and said, go and buy it from India. So India was the only country giving the vaccines. Now, vaccine diplomacy had a domino effect in India. Suddenly, Africa registered more that here is a continent which is so grateful to you. So now, why don't we rethink? But it also created debt stress. Countries could not repay their loans. So the line of credit system, which ran well for 15 years, now nobody was ready to take a line of credit. Nobody wanted more debt. And we were having problems in getting the credit serviced also. So we have to look to a new model. The model must use capacity building and training and human resource development as in the past and do it more. But at the same time, we have to understand that debt doesn't work anymore. So we have to go for an FDI-led model. Encourage more Indians to invest in Africa, which means that the grants which we were using to subsidize various things in Africa, we should now actually use to support Indian companies by lowering the cost of their finance, by giving them, for instance, if you want to set up a vocational training institute, you ask the Indian investor, what kind of people do you want? If he says, I want people trained in this art or this skill, you set up an institution where he will train people from African country and employ them. So you must become an intermediary rather than a standalone player. And thirdly, you must cater to African priorities as you always do. So in 2018, Prime Minister Modi in the Uganda Parliament for the first time spelled out India's Africa policy. It's called the 10 principles. In first one is Africa will be the top of our priority. We'll always listen to you. We'll always help you. Now, besides this, what are my recommendations to do. One of them is that India must use its G20 presidency to bring the African Union as a permanent member of the G20. Now, this is keeping in line with our original policy. We will always help Africa to have its voice heard internationally. Now, since the UN Security Council expansion is not happening, this is our best opportunity to do this. So I was very happy when Prime Minister Modi wrote to all the G20 saying,
Yes.
I'm putting this on the agenda and let's bring Africa in. Now, this is a very brave diplomatic move. You know, from the time the G20 was started in 2008 as a summit, nobody has dared to tinker with the membership.
Now
Why?
it is added.
So many people want to get in. India is the one who said, okay, I don't care, Africa needs to be in. So we have used our diplomatic capital to do that, which is the flowering of India's Africa policy. The second is the FDI-led approach. The third is we have started trilateral cooperation. Now, this is largely with the G7 countries who, as I told you earlier, prefer the Indian model to the Chinese model. And they also understand that their model is not working in Africa anymore. So the Indian model works. So the OECD countries are trilaterally working with India in Africa. The Germans have started a grant program where 5 or 6 places we are already doing agriculture related programs to build capacities. The British have started a joint fund to support impact investing. Impact investing is private sector funds go in to invest to achieve the SDGs. This is great. So there is no debt, no sovereign guarantee. It's a good investment decision to support African ideas to achieve the SDGs, which otherwise we are falling behind. With France, with the EU, with Japan, different types of trilaterals are being thought of. Recently, when Prime Minister was in the UAE, this was mentioned that we will do with the UAE also. Singapore, with many countries. Because why? Why do they all come to us? It is because actually our model works. That is
Trust.
the
Trust.
that is important. Now, I think I should also speak a bit about the strategic dimension. Now, I
Go
told
ahead,
you
sir.
that in 1958, the Harar Military Academy was the first one. But over a period of time, India has had 20 military training teams in Africa. And we have set up several, defense training institutions in Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, Botswana, many places. But today, does India have the deep pockets that China has that we can continue to try and saturate all of Africa? After all, we have since 2018 opened 15 new embassies in Africa. So today we have embassies in 47 out of 54 countries. They cost money. LOC system doesn't work. So my suggestion is that we should strategize which countries are more important to us, either for their resources or for their location. And the location wise, the most important are those on the coast of the Indian Ocean in East and Southern Africa. We have focused a lot on Seychelles and Mauritius, but we now need to expand that. Mozambique, we have worked a lot. In Mozambique, we have a proposed $20 billion investment in coal and gas, which will give us energy security. Since 2008, India diversified its energy supply, so a lot of our energy comes from West Africa. It comes around the Cape of Good Hope and goes through the Mozambique Channel.
Channels.
So we need to focus our strategic interest around that channel, Mozambique and Madagascar, and also the island called Agalega, where we want to set up a facility. Now, we should work with these countries on the coast. Most of them are members of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. We should support them more. the eastern and southern African coast is part of India's Indo-Pacific policy. Now, American Indo-Pacific policy doesn't come there, but more and more French are ready to come. The Japanese are ready to come, but India's policy actually starts with Eastern
Correct.
Africa and goes up to the Pacific. So that is the strategic dimension. We have been holding AFINDEX, which is a exercise with African countries. We have held a chief of army staff conclave. We have held Raksha Mantri's meeting. We need to focus this on specific countries of interest to us. One of them being, will they buy defense supplies from us? That is part of strategic thinking. Is that country going to be on the UN Security Council? That's strategic thinking. Are they on the IAEA? Strategic thinking. So, I mean, you need to keep refocusing on some African countries, keeping in view the limitations of your budget and narrowing your focus for deeper engagement. I think this is the broad policy framework that I think we started with. And today, modern India, whether it is vaccines, defense supplies, its ability to influence the G20 or contribute funds to, for your development, all that India is ready to do. So I think, General Shankar, I'm going to stop here with say that this is a big opportunity. Thank you.
और थैंक्स अ लॉट सर, आपने बहुत अच्छा और डिटेल तरीके से सब कुछ बताया. एंड फ्रॉम योर टॉक, व्हाट डू आई टेक, एंड व्हेन आई से आई टेक, ऑल ऑफ अस टेक. We have three pillars which are very strong in South Africa. एक पिलर है हमारा जो political pillar है, governmental pillar है, which has always helped South Africa form their governments, or the not South Africa, the African states gain their nationhoods and sustain their governments from then to now. So we already have, that is a very strong pillar of political support, which is always, I think, the ground or the basic edifice on which everything is built. दूसरी चीज जो आपने इम्पोर्टेंट बताया, हमारे पास एक सॉलिड बेस है जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर का है, पर ये प्राइवेट सेक्टर आज के दिन थोड़ा बिखरा हुआ है, छोटे छोटे. पर ये प्राइवेट सेक्टर आपको ग्राउंड लेवल रीच देता है और ट्रस्ट जनरेट करता है, क्योंकि ये प्राइवेट सेक्टर लोकल आमदनी को बढ़ाता है, लोकल पीपल टू पीपल कॉन्टैक्ट को बढ़ाता है, और ये जो ट्रस्ट फैक्टर है जो सबसे बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है दो देश के बीच में, उसको उत्पन्न करता है. और तीसरा जो आपने बोला कि पीपल टू पीपल कॉन्टैक्ट, कि वो लोग हमारे लोगों के ऊपर भरोसा रखते हैं, और भरोसा जो है वो दो देशों के बीच में बहुत बड़ा है. और इसमें हम एक देश और एक कॉन्टिनेंट के बीच में नहीं, एक देश और 54 देशों के बीच का पीपल टू पीपल कॉन्टैक्ट के ऊपर ट्रस्ट की बात हम कर रहे हैं. अभी बात आया है कि what I would like a little thing which you have to probably look into the future. इंडिया बदल रहा है और आपने सब कुछ बता दिया. इंडिया जैसे बदल रहा है, वी हैव टू इंक्रीज आवर फुटप्रिंट, एंड वी आर इंक्रीजिंग आवर फुटप्रिंट. एज आवर इकोनॉमी गोज अप, वी विल हैव मोर कैपेसिटी टू ब्रिंग इन. सो आपने जो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट बताया स्ट्रेटेजिकली, वी हैव टू स्टार्ट लुकिंग एट अफ्रीका जियो इकोनॉमिकली, strategically, so that we get into a real win-win situation with them, where our investment and their resources increase the overall geo-economics of Africa. And that, I think, is the next step. And for that, of course, we can use the global South-South dialogue. जो पहले हम non-aligned बोलते थे, अभी वो उसका आकार अभी global South-South की तरह आ रहा है. But what is great, आपने जो बताया है कि ये जो ट्राइलेटरल कोऑपरेशन है, ये जो डायलॉग अभी होने वाला है साउथ साउथ का, इट इज आल्सो सपोर्टेड बाय द ग्लोबल नॉर्थ, क्योंकि ग्लोबल नॉर्थ इज इंटरेस्टेड इन दिस डायलॉग टू गो. और जो मैं देखता हूं, इसमें आपने दो कंट्रीज के बारे में जिक्र किया, जापान और चाइना. Japan moved into Africa for its own requirements because it had surplus capital which it had to invest in Africa. It invested not only in Africa, it invested all over. It took it to the globe, and that model is somewhat trying to be replicated by China unsuccessfully, right? But China is also there. But चाइना के साथ बहुत ये जो जितने देश हैं वो कर्ज में डूबे हुए हैं इन द डेट ट्रैप, एंड वी ऑल्सो हैव टू हेल्प देम गेट आउट ऑफ इट. Oh, is there a special focus as to how to do this, or do we need to do this? Because I'm now talking of three tracks. One is geoeconomics, get into a win-win situation, and marginalize China. It's a big ask. It needs vision. How do you think this needs to be going ahead, taking into consideration that our economy is also going to go up in the same proportion, and the fact that you have, unlike the earlier times, you have the global north backing you in some manner.
Thank you. So, China could make a breakthrough in Africa because the Western countries, who were the traditional lenders, including the World Bank and all, started putting too many conditions. So the African countries started going to China, who asked no questions.
And
They
they
would say,
gave.
and they would only say, don't bother about the rules. I will charge you more. You don't give me a guarantee. So many countries went into that blindly. But the problem with most Chinese projects was because they were like Chinese projects. They had no profit motive. They had no business plan. They were just project to be done and spend money. And most of the return from that money went to Chinese companies and Chinese people. They even brought their own labor. So there was no local capacity building. BRI projects in Africa are economic impetus for China. But now that China is not able to export its way out of trouble, the BRI is floundering. Now, the G7 and the EU also came up with ideas, build back better, gateway to, but nothing happens in them. So, India, if they involved India in it, we could reduce the cost of implementation and deliver better. But the trilateral cooperation is still at small levels. It has not gone into the infrastructure level as yet. But there is a $1 trillion opportunity for Africa in infrastructure. But there are not even enough detailed project reports for people to finance. So I have been recommending that India should play a bigger role with regional development banks in Africa who have got private sector windows and start funding those. Because with the Africa Continental FTA, the regional markets will become more consolidated and Indian investors will have larger markets to deal with. So therefore support the Indian investor, and if you can't do it directly, do it through a regional development bank who has a private sector. So in 2022, Exim Bank actually gave a $100 million line to the EBIT, ECOWAS Bank for Industry and Development in West Africa. But we need to do this. But the question about what will you do for infrastructure, that remains unanswered. India has the companies to do it,
But
but
not the money.
not the money. So with Japan, we are trying to talk about company to company projects. With the West, we are talking of government led projects, different models. But I think we will get there.
Right.
Meanwhile, India is looking at hybrid financing through the International Solar Alliance to push solar energy in Africa in a big way. Because among all the statistics that you gave right in the beginning, I think
Tropic
there
of.
are two I want to give more. Africa has 10 landlocked countries.
Yes, sir.
25% of African people live within 100 kilometers of a coastline. And 33 of Africa's 54 countries are LDCs, least developed countries. So these are the realities of Africa which
Yes,
we
yes.
have to deal with.
Right, sir.